Well, for more, I'm joined in the studio by the founding Chief Executive Officer of the United States Studies Centre at the University of Sydney, Professor Geoffrey Garrett. Professor, thanks so much for your time tonight.
As always.
How do you think the address went down in the Congress, but more broadly and perhaps more importantly, with the American people?
Well, in the Congress, obviously it tended to have the normal divide, which is partisan on domestic things, and then they rallied round the flag on foreign policy issues, and in particular, sort of support for American troops. That was the strongest round of applause. In terms of how it played in the country, I'm not sure at this point. Obama is using a new tactic. He's talking about fairness. Americans typically talk about equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome. Fairness was the big story here, and obviously his Republican opponents for president, Mitt Romney and Newt Gingrich, were the real targets.
Before we talk a little more about that fairness and entwined around the economy, bookending his address, as you've mentioned, there were the military operations and their stated achievements and the folks who have driven that, including the war in Iraq, something that, of course, President Obama was opposed to, and using the mission to assassinate Osama bin Laden as a metaphor for what America as a country could do if they all stuck together. How did that strike you, and how do you think that in particular will strike the electorate?
Well, there's an on the one hand, on the other hand. On the one hand, I was struck by the fact that Obama emphasized the fact that he's gotten out of Iraq and he's getting out of Afghanistan. He didn't talk much about what's left behind, rising violence in Iraq, and who knows what is in prospect for Afghanistan down the road. But his strongest card to play when it comes to national security is yes, I ended Bush's wars, but I did the job Bush couldn't do. I got Osama bin Laden.
On the economy, in outlining an economy built to last, this term he used a couple of times, and promoting the idea of fairness and equality. Before we talk a little about that, let's have a listen to a little of what he said.
We can either settle for a country where a shrinking number of people do really well, while a growing number of Americans barely get by. Or we can restore an economy where everyone gets a fair shot, and everyone does their fair share, and everyone plays by the same set of rules.
Talking about fair share there, he also talked about tax rates for the wealthy, thinking they get too many breaks. Now, at the moment, there is, of course, this controversy surrounding Mitt Romney's fortune, what he earned last year versus what he paid in tax. How much was this a dig at his potential presidential rival, as well as being a rehearsal, perhaps, for his election pitch to the American people?
I think it's both. So let's talk about the second one first. Election pitch to the American people. Obama believes there's something to the Occupy Wall Street movement, and it is this notion that a tiny sliver of the American population is doing extremely well. Most people are hurting, so he wants to play to them. But if Mitt Romney is his opponent, Mitt Romney isn't only in the 1%, he's in the 1% of the 1%. Obama said today that anyone who earned $1 million should have their income taxed at minimum 30%. A few hours before Obama spoke, Mitt Romney finally fessed up that his income in 2010 and 2011 was about $20 million per year, and he only paid 15% tax. So that fairness speech is mobilizing a Occupy Wall Street electorate, but it's also a direct beeline attack on Mitt Romney.
And is this something, even if it's not Mitt Romney, but the broad themes that were outlined here today, is this something that he will pursue over the next 8-9 months?
Yeah, I think so. Americans are mad as hell. They're mad at two things. They're mad at Washington for not getting things done and being driven by insiderism, and they're mad at Wall Street. So Mitt Romney looks like Wall Street. Obama's other potential Republican opponent, Newt Gingrich, looks like a Washington insider. And the good news for Obama is that Mitt Romney is already pointing to the fact that Newt Gingrich is a high-paid lobbyist lobbying for big banks and financial sector firms in the housing crisis against the interests of average Americans. So this sort of, Obama said it's not class warfare, it's common sense, but clearly Republicans see this as class warfare, and they're worried it's warfare they might lose.
In regard to the common sense side of things, if you're sitting somewhere which is doing it tough, in some regional centre in the US, and you're listening to this, how hard would it be not to be thinking, well, hang on, you've had 3 years in there. This is a sluggish economy, and you could do more to help me to earn more rather than just attack the ultra-wealthy.
Yeah, here's the trick. Normally, if this were quote-unquote a normal election, we would say Barack Obama has virtually no chance of winning because 8% plus unemployment, 30% of Americans underwater on their mortgages, their houses are worth 30% less than they were before the global financial crisis. That's an election Obama shouldn't be able to win. The interesting thing at the moment is it's not a referendum on Obama's record. It's an election on these very different visions for where the country should go. A fairness doctrine Obama now has versus a Republican one which says, listen, what we've got to do is cut taxes further on the rich because they're the people who create the jobs.
Looking more broadly, foreign policy, it didn't make much of a mention today in that hour or so long speech, and the focus on this region, which was a big deal when he was here just a couple of months ago, rated barely more than a couple of lines. Why is that?
Well, foreign policy typically doesn't matter so much in elections. I think the sort of Iraq War election in 2004 and maybe the reaction against that in 2008 are actually the exception, not the rule. So normally it's about domestic policy. In this case, I believe that Obama actually has taken quite a big risk being so out there in the Asia-Pacific with respect to his agenda because it doesn't play well at home. In fact, when he was in the region, he had to make sure that he couldn't be in Sydney because no one could see him near the Opera House because it would look like a holiday. He couldn't wear a colourful shirt at the East Asia Summit because it would look like a holiday. So what that tells me is that Obama actually is very serious about his Asia-Pacific pivot. He just it can't help him at home. He just wants to make sure it doesn't hurt him too much.
Now, the big catchphrase coming out of today near the end where he said, America is back. Back from what?
Yeah, back from what's so interesting, isn't it? Everyone else in the world says that the challenge for an American president is to manage relative decline. The problem in the US is you can't campaign on we're number 2. So if you actually look at what Obama is doing in terms of foreign policy and foreign economic policy, he often says, listen, we're losing out to other countries. He said it in the speech today. You just can't come out and say we're number 2. So a sort of roaring back post-financial crisis, post the diversion of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. That's the kind of message Obama wants to give. In an environment in which the Australian Foreign Minister, Kevin Rudd, said only about 10 days in New York that he thinks that China will become the biggest economy in the world as early as 2018, pretty close to the end of Obama's second term, he would hope.
Geoffrey, what was the most telling thing Obama didn't say in his address today?
I thought it was a long speech with a sort of laundry list of pretty detailed policy propositions for this year. There were some framing documents, but the thing that I was struck by was that it really didn't have a big underlying narrative. Obama, that's the kind of thing that Obama is famous for. I don't know whether he's getting speech fatigue. Maybe he's not. Maybe what he was doing was thinking, listen, at the moment, it's much better for me if the two Republican antagonists, Newt Gingrich and Mitt Romney, continue to beat each other up. So why don't I just sort of withdraw for a little while, by the way, they're giving me ammunition that I can use against them when I need it in a few months. Gingrich, the Wall Street job killer. Romney, the Wall Street job killer, Gingrich, the consummate Washington lobbyist. So maybe in some sense it was a sort of tactical withdrawal from the fray. It was so different to the Republican presidential debates at the moment, which are really jaw-to-jaw sort of riveting political theatre. I saw less of that in Obama today.
Well, I guess he's got quite a few months ahead to get the narrative out there and to make sure there is no speech fatigue. Professor Geoffrey Garrett, as always, terrific speaking with you. Thanks so much for your time.
My pleasure.